What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor? In this nationwide survey of general practitioners, surgeons, throat specialists, diagnosticians, and so on, the brand named most was Camel.
Welcome to Amusing Jews, where we celebrate Jewish contributors and contributions to American popular culture. I'm Jonathan Friedmann.
And I'm Joey Angelfield.
Producer-engineer Mike Tomren is working somewhere behind the scenes. Amusing Jews is a project of Adat Chaverim, Congregation for Humanistic Judaism, the Jewish Museum of the American West, and Atheists United Studios. Hey Joey, back in the 1950s, when television was young, programs that aired on the 3 U.S. networks not only entertained audiences, but also created the medium itself.
We're happy to welcome back Julian David Stone, an author, photographer, and filmmaker whose novels include The Strange Birth, Short Life, and Sudden Death of Justice Girl. Julian, welcome back to Amusing Jews.
Thanks for having me again.
For starters, who is Justice Girl?
Justice Girl is a character that the main character of my novel creates. He's a writer for television, and he creates a character kind of based on the Superman craze of the 1950s called Justice Girl. And it goes on, he does it quickly as sort of a parting shot as he's being fired from a TV show, and the show or the character quite unexpectedly explodes in popularity, and it's about what he has to deal with suddenly having this character that he created just take off and become a sensation.
I know that with any novel, there's a lot of the author's imprint on it, and you were just telling me before we went on that this was your transition book from screenwriting to becoming a novelist, and the idea of focusing on a screenwriter is pretty interesting.
Yeah, they say write what you know. And I've always been obsessed with this period in television in the 1950s. And so when I decided myself to take a shot at writing my first novel, this just popped into my head. It was very easy to put myself in the shoes of a writer having something sort of take off. I had nothing that quite went as crazy as what happens to the character in the novel, but I did have something similar happen to me at the beginning of my career with a script that I wrote that sort of exploded in popularity. So I sort of tapped into some of that. And like I said, mostly my obsession with these early days of television. I wanted to kind of merge all of that stuff.
Your book meticulously constructs a fictitious 1950s TV network, the Regal Television Network, in a way that reminded me of Capitol Pictures and the underrated Coen Brothers film Hail Caesar. What kind of research went into reconstructing that bygone era?
Oh God, it was so fun doing it. I just threw myself into it. The network in my story, the Regal Television Network, is sort of based on a forgotten network. There was actually a fourth network in the 1950s called the Dumont Television Network, and it was sort of based on that. The Dumont Network fizzled out by the mid-1950s and disappeared, but I sort of created, it was sort of based on that, having this other network besides the ones that we all know. And in terms of research, I watched all these amazing TV dramas that were done then. It was incredible, the work that was being done on television. And when I wrote the book 15 years ago or so, there were still some people alive who had been a part of this. There was one person, Andrew McCullough, I interviewed for hours. Interestingly enough, sort of connecting to my other book, It's Alive, this person I interviewed was the boyfriend of Julie Adams, who played the woman in The Creature from the Black Lagoon. That's how I knew about him, and he had been right in the thick of this. He had directed during the 1950s in television, so he was incredibly helpful. But it was amazing talking to these people that had lived, and the one thing I will say about them was, to a person, they didn't want it to end. We sort of haven't touched on what was unique. What was unique about this version of television, that up until the late 1950s, everything was live. Videotape had not been invented yet. So from after World War II, when television really explodes, up until the late 50s, everything you saw on your television was happening at that moment in a TV studio somewhere. And the people that worked on it loved it. It was the greatest thing because you had such control. The suits couldn't re-edit your material afterwards. What went out was the final product. So that was where so much of the research led me to talking to people that were alive then. Everybody was so young. It was a new field, and a lot of the Hollywood actors in the beginning didn't want anything to do with it. So it was very centered out of New York. And these people were just young and exploring this wonderful new medium.
Yeah, I think it definitely took a lot of energy to do that kind of television. And the way that you describe it also gives it that kind of, very frantic, like everyone's just scrambling to get things done. So you basically have to be a young person to do that.
Oh, for sure. And when, like I said, everything was live, if you go on YouTube and look at some of these live dramas, the fact that it was live, they didn't let it keep them from doing anything. They were flying walls out and doing stuff. And I heard Martin Landau, the actor, talking about acting in these dramas, that sometimes you would arrive, everything had to keep moving and it was live. You'd arrive where you were supposed to be and the camera would be there, but the actor you were supposed to talk to wasn't. So you just have to start the scene talking to empty air, hoping that the person showed up before they went to the two shot. So you can imagine how much fun it was, being alive in this era doing these crazy dramas.
Talking about something less fun, part of the backdrop of the book is McCarthyism and the Red Scare. How does that factor into the story?
It's a huge part of my story because, unfortunately, it was a huge part of the beginning of television. As I said, this era that I explore really starts in 1946 with the end of World War II and goes until about 57, 58 when videotape came in. And this was the height of the Red Scare, and it decimated television. I mean, people told stories about, literally somebody, in the morning you're rehearsing something, you break for lunch and you come back and the actor you were working with is gone because something happened and he was blacklisted. Literally, it was happening that quickly and that out of control.
That's interesting because you mentioned that because it was live, actors were kind of getting away with stuff because no one could control it. But I imagine some of those, Red Scare people were watching very carefully.
It was more the direct meddling that they didn't have to deal with because you couldn't re-edit it afterwards. You know what I mean? It's like once it became a medium that when the creative people were done and it went off and the network could do anything with it, it changed the nature of it.
Enjoying the show? Click like and subscribe.
There are some nice Jewish references scattered throughout Justice Girl. Were you simply staying true to that era of television production, or was there something more?
A little of both. I mean, as in Hollywood, where there's particularly in the beginning, there was a tremendous Jewish presence in the formation of the studios. Television was a little different in the initial formation because the television networks really grew out of the radio networks, and that wasn't particularly dominated by Jews the way the film studio was. But some of those early writers, a lot of them were Jewish, and I wanted to tap into that, and I wanted to tap into my own family's experience. That's what was so fun. Was my family, of course, is from New York, like most Jews in this country. They at least start there or have a big presence there. So I really wanted to write about that period of the 50s in New York, and the Johnny Derby's the main character, and he's Jewish, and I wanted to write about his experience. But you mentioned also the Red Scare being a big part of it, because part of my story is that the lead actress who plays Justice Girl, her father is a senator who's very much exploiting the Red Scare. So I wanted to show the other side of what was going on at that time too.
Yeah, I mean, in there was, also some subtle and not so subtle anti-Semitism and, some New York hatred as well. So it's kind of funny. I mean, maybe it's a fun thing to write as a New Yorker, people who hate New York, and maybe it comes to grow on them.
And, you see it to this day. It's a city that's always picked on inevitably by people who actually live there, which is always funny to me, that these people that like to dump on it's like, you could move away, none of them seem to want to, but they want to talk trash about it.
I think Los Angeles is very similar in that regard.
Yeah.
Each chapter takes us behind the scenes of the making of 1950s TV when, as we've alluded to, television was performed live. What did we lose when TV started shifting to recorded content?
Well, that's a great question. As I said, the meddling, became much more, of an issue because they had a lot more control in post-production, and they could chop it up. If you did it a certain way, they could change it to how they wanted. And the other thing I just love to talk about this era is that people don't realize how quickly this whole thing happened. And the great example I like to give is in 1946 is the first year after World War II ends of sort of the return to normal production of goods in this country. During the war, everything was they stopped making dishwashers and stuff. Everything was related to the war effort. In 1946, they go back to making consumer goods. And in 1946, there are 6,000 televisions in America. By 1951, there are 12 million. That's how much television explodes after World War II. And that's why it was such an exciting, chaotic era, because nobody knew what, it's a little bit like when sound came into movies. Like there's these sort of early, they're trying to figure out, like, what do people want to see? Like some networks in the beginning literally just hung a television out the window on Fifth Avenue and just filmed it. Like they didn't know what people wanted to see. And then very quickly you start developing these dramas, which turn into these huge live productions. And because television was mostly in the major cities, what they were making was, shall we say, a little more erudite. They were able to do a lot more of, you read some of the stuff that was on at 9 o'clock on a network, you would be shocked. They were doing Shakespeare plays. They were doing all kinds of stuff. We were just looking up like a King Lear production. Can you imagine King Lear on at 9 o'clock on CBS in this day and age, But that's what they were doing back then. And it was, and live.
Lear, Lear! Peace at the gates and let thy folly in! And thy dear judgment out! Go, go, my people!
One of the things I appreciate about early television, live television, is that they did take that radio cue of having somebody kind of cart something out in the middle of a program and do a little advertisement for Carnation's concentrated milk or whatever. That was kind of a fun element looking back at some of those earlier shows.
It was interesting in the beginning, mostly through the live era. It kind of coincides with videotape coming in. The control of the shows was the sponsors, because you had Chrysler sponsoring an entire hour. So you had to listen to them. Well, it changed and they started breaking up the advertising into 1-minute chunks. So suddenly the advertisers lost their power and it was the networks that got the power. Because if if Chrysler was putting up the money for that 1 hour, you had to listen to them. Well, suddenly if they're one of 20 people advertising during the show, you don't got to listen to them, because if they don't like it, you can get another person to put up the money for that hour or for that minute, of television time.
I noticed that with this book and your other novel, It's Alive, about the making of the 1931 Frankenstein film, you seem to have nostalgia for a time before your own. Is that fair to say?
I think that's definitely fair to say. I'm not one of those people stuck in the past, but I just grew up loving this stuff. Maybe it's just my own family experience, wanting to find a way to sort of channel that. But yeah, I definitely prefer that. I think it's because it gives me an excuse to do a lot of research, and I love research. Whenever I write anything, I always find myself wanting to keep doing research, and at a certain point I have to stop and start actually writing this thing, because I just love it. And in terms of the type of research that is my favorite, I love stuff from the period. I love reading the trades from back then, because I love reading it when there isn't a foregone conclusion. Now anything written about this era is written through the prism of knowing, one, it's going to come to an end, and two, that videotape is coming and is going to change everything. When you do research and read it in the time, nobody knows that's coming. And so it's fun to hear people talking about it. And when I was doing the research for the Frankenstein novel, it was fun. Nobody knew if this movie was going to work. It could have been a big old flop. So it's always interesting to see history when it's not when it hasn't been concluded yet.
Yeah, Jonathan and I were talking before we started, and I would, classify this, as well as It's Alive, as sort of realistic fiction. Clearly, a lot of research went into it. But also, on the topic of Justice Girl, I thought it was kind of fun and entertaining that she came out of a comedy writer room, and was sort of inspired by comic books. It seems like a little bit, of a spoof, a la Sid Caesar's writing room, Mel Brooks and such, and also like Mad Magazine and more.
Oh, 100%. That writer's room is, if there's one period in time I could be dropped into, to have been in Sid Caesar's writer's room, that would have been my dream job, to have been one of those guys in that room. So that's clearly 100% what that show in the beginning that he's a writer on is supposed to be based on.
Yeah, and something that Joey's reminding me of, I have a difficult time reading novels in general. I'm much more of a nonfiction reader. And what I appreciate about both of your novels is that they're kind of both, right? That I actually learn a lot about that era from a historical perspective. It is kind of a nonfiction bit to it, plus there's a story. So maybe it's the best of both worlds. I don't know if you feel that way.
Like I said, I like history and I like research, but I also like stripping back the mystique of, this was a job. And it was an exciting job, and it was a job everybody wanted. But this was a job. They were trying to get a show on the air, and that's their biggest concern. And it's sort of been, I certainly love the whole idea of the golden age of television or the golden age of Hollywood. But in reality, it was a job, and I think getting into the nuts and bolts of it makes it interesting about how they did pull off all this stuff.
I think the designation golden age is always retrospective.
Oh, for sure. For sure. Although it is interesting hearing, like I said, the people that were there, they certainly felt like it. I discovered this era through Rod Serling. I think we've sort of mentioned him, which came from my being obsessed with the Twilight Zone. And he'd actually gotten his career started in the golden age of television. He burst onto the scene with some of the classic live dramas of the era. And I remember, I think it was on PBS, they were already calling the mid-50s the golden age of television by the late 70s. So it didn't take long to call it that. But in a way, it makes sense because you had such a seismic shift with videotape coming in. So you had it's like I said, it's around 57 when it really starts being used. And pretty much by 1960, the live era is pretty much gone for good.
Just as a funny aside, I'm wondering what ruined television more, if it was censors or advertisers.
Well, it's a funny thing because I'm also not one of those people who thinks everything was better back then. We are in a golden age right now. It is dumbfounding how much incredible television is out there. It's sort of not even just television. It's just we have unbelievable content. It's impossible to keep up with it, and the quality of it. I mean, to have a show like Succession, I mean, that is insane how great that show was. It's that people don't remember the garbage. There was, as much as I'm a fan of this era, it was not all great. There's a lot of stuff that's been understandably forgotten. We remember the good stuff. And, I think it's a fair thing to say that at any time in history, 95% of any art form is not the best. We just remember the 5% that is great. And to some extent, I honestly believe we're in another golden age. I mean, there's something for everyone. And, there's a lot of stuff that's not great, but God, it's impossible to keep up with it. There's so many shows. I can't keep it. I don't even try.
To be fair, in that something for everyone configuration, there is stuff for people with really bad taste also.
Oh, for sure. But there always was. You can go back into the 50s, the show that's always sort of mentioned is My Mother, the Car. In any era, in the golden age of Hollywood, we remember the great films of the 30s. I can tell you I've watched, because particularly, watching, doing Frankenstein and being very involved with the product of Universal Studios, I've made it my job to watch as many films as I can find of theirs, even outside of the horror stuff. There's a lot of films that we've forgotten that are best left forgotten, It can be quite a slog.
Well, speaking of this golden era and maybe some optimism for stuff coming out, do you have any new books in the works?
I do. We've sort of referenced my novel, It's Alive, about the making of Frankenstein. I am writing the sequel to that. It wasn't something I intended to ever do, but literally from the moment It's Alive came out, and when I do a lot of convention appearances and I do a lot of live presentations, it started being one of the first questions I asked. Have you ever thought about writing a sequel? And after hearing that for about a year or two, I started to think about writing a sequel, and I'm quite knee deep in that right now. I'm writing the sequel to It's Alive called She's Alive, so you can probably figure out what it's about. It's centered around the making of the sequel to Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein. So I'm quite in the world of 1935 right now, watching a lot of movies from 1935 that Universal made and everybody else made, among other bits of research.
Does that mean the Son of Frankenstein book is next?
You know, it has occurred to me because that's sort of my fear, because, you know, I've never actually been in this position before where people are pretty consistently emailing me or texting me or sending messages through social media asking me when the book is going to be done. And I know, you know, it's getting there and it's going to get done. And then I know the first time I do a convention after it's finished, that's going to be the first question. Have you thought of writing another one? And so I think that could work. That could work.
Well, we look forward to having you back on when all of these books come out.
Oh, would love to. Anytime. Absolutely.
And to our audience, now back to your regularly scheduled lives.
Amusing Jews is here to amuse you. If you like being amused, go ahead and click like and subscribe.